Hello, English 112 students. Welcome to another lecture for our class, this time on the Caves of Steel. I'm going to cover a lot of ground about literature and about this book in particular. And you can call this a lecture of a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And it covers several different topics I'd like you to think about as you read the book. And we shall commence to learn more. So I'd like to start with utopias and dystopias. So utopia originated from a book by Sir Thomas More way back around Shakespeare's time, and maybe even a little bit before Shakespeare. And this has to do with an ideal and perfect place or state where everyone lives in harmony and everything is for the best. A dystopia is an imaginary place where everything is as bad as it can possibly be. Now, as you think about Caves of Steel, would you call this a utopia or a dystopia? Probably not a utopia, for sure. I don't know that if things are as bad as they can possibly be, but it's not great. You know, as you're reading along, you notice that there's a lot of prejudice in the society, a lot of environmental damage. You know, it's not a great place to be. You can think of modern versions of utopias and dystopias, not that Caves of Steel isn't modern, but we see examples of this all the time, and especially dystopias. And as we approach 2012 and people's for lack of a better word, mysticism as far as that goes, and thinking about the apocalypse and all that kind of stuff. The apocalypse, of course, is a dystopia where everything in society falls apart and it's hellish, really. A couple of good examples recently of dystopian works are The Road by Cormac McCarthy, in which Earth has been basically rendered difficult, beyond difficult, to live in because of nuclear war. And also, you may have seen or read The Hunger Games. The Hunger Games, of course, is a dystopian society. A utopian society is harder for me to think of one, really. But Star Trek, the Star Trek universe, is a utopian society. People get along. They are just out to explore space. There's no money. You know, money doesn't exist. People are working at jobs to their highest potential. You never see poor people, at least very rarely. You see them on other worlds, really. And so those are examples of dystopias and utopias. Now next, we have a new word. How exciting. And the word has a lot of syllables, of course, and it's anthropomorphize. Anthropomorphize. And that is to project human characteristics to non-human creatures or objects. Another word for this, or maybe an action of an acting of anthropomorphizing, is the figure of speech called personification. Personification is saying the wind was whispering in the trees. Well, it's a metaphor, of course, because neither animals nor inanimate objects nor trees whisper. Human beings whisper, right? But it's a figure of speech we use to describe the sound of the wind in the trees. This can go way over the top often, and many literary critics consider personification and anthropomorphizing simplistic, especially if it's done in a sentimental way. Lassie, the show Lassie, comes to mind, and they anthropomorphized Lassie. She always goes and finds Timmy in the well, and you know, she manages to know things that Uh, most dogs probably would not. So Lassie might be an example. She just seems to sense people's feelings and so on. And so that would be sentimental anthropomorphizing of a dog. Now, a little bit more on characters and character development. When you're looking to analyze and especially evaluate a literary work, you're looking at realistic characters, even when they're flat. If they represent stereotypes, it's still good if they have a history, right? That they do things that are believable if purely evil or purely good. You know, Helen might be an example of a character with that is realistically drawn, but maybe somewhat flat from Jane Eyre. And Mrs. Reed as a flat character also, and yet is human and believable. Characters should also be relatable, even the flat ones. And they're relatable if they have values and emotions and histories. Now, of course, they're not going to have the extensive history that the round characters are going to have, but they have some, and you can understand them. Now, characters should move beyond stereotypes, even the flat ones, to a degree. And I heard this put really well in the book that I used last year to teach creative writing. And that one said that characters should move beyond stereotypes, and good characters are people who happen to embezzle rather than they are embezzlers. They are people who happen to be engaged in organized crime rather than gangsters. The person in this book says, we may need gamblers and misers in our stories to tell them, but we must write them not as misers, but people who happen to be miserly. So if you take a few minutes and kind of think about the difference between a miser and someone who happens to be miserly. So to move on to specific information to Caves of Steel and Isaac Asimov. Isaac Asimov, this is only one of many robot books. He started with I, Robot, which was actually a series of short stories originally that was put together into a book. And there is the Robots of Dawn, and robots find their way into many of Asimov's book. And they have two characteristics that have been extremely influential in science fiction ever since he came up with these in the 1940s and 50s. And the 3 laws of robotics is a moral code that is embedded into the programming of R. Daneel Olivaw and all of the robots of Asimov's creation. A robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. It's the first law. Second law is a robot must obey the orders given it by human beings except where such orders would conflict with the first law. And number 3, a robot must protect its own existence as long as protection does not conflict with the first or second laws. And you can see just a brief clip of Asimov explaining these on one of the video clips I included in our course content for this week. The positronic brain is really interesting too, and it's a concept that Asimov developed to make robots with human-like consciousness. And I think that Data, for example, in Star Trek The Next Generation is a great example of the positronic brain, and I think in several episodes they mention his positronic brain. So keep that in mind when you think about R. Daneel Olivaw. Now, I admit it, I am a diehard Star Trek The Next Generation geek. The best example I can think of is the character Data from The Next Generation. And I included some links just from some little clips in the series. I would recommend that you go to a site. I don't know if you are members of Netflix, but you could rent a Netflix or two that have to do with Data as the protagonist for that episode. The one where he creates an offspring, a daughter, is a lovely episode, as are many, many others that show Data's humanity. And what does his humanity stem from? His humanity stems from his positronic brain. And really it's artificial intelligence at its perhaps best and even scariest. There are dystopian novels where, one doesn't know the difference between robots and humans, and they realize the prejudice against them in society, and they exact revenge. All kinds of different stories like this. And I was going to add something else, and I can't think of what it was. So thank you for listening, and enjoy the clips from YouTube, and I'll see you in class.